Hello, everyone, and welcome to K2's Best Practices for Formatting Excel Pivot Tables. My name is Tommy Stevens, and for the next 25 minutes or thereabouts, it's going to be my pleasure to lead you through some really good information, I think, on how we can format our pivot tables much more efficiently, much more effectively than by perhaps using some of the more manual techniques that we may have used in the past. I hope you're looking forward to a great session. I certainly am. As we get started, you will see just a couple of things about me appearing on your screen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering the biographical information. I normally don't. But I do want to emphasize my email address and my Twitter handle for you. That way you'll know how to reach me after this session is over. If you have any follow-up questions, please be sure to reach out to me. Tommy at K2E.com, as you can see, is the email address, or you could direct message me on Twitter, where my Twitter handle is at Tommy Stevens. Whichever way is more comfortable and easier for you, I'll be happy to respond, and I'll do my best to get back with you just as quickly as I possibly can. As we begin to take a look at the content for this session, specific learning objectives, first, let's make sure that we understand how to apply what I would call global pivot table formats using pivot table styles. Styles in pivot tables, like styles elsewhere in Excel and frankly over even in Word, are a grossly underutilized feature. And if we grasp the concept of styles, then I think we're going to be way ahead of the game in terms of formatting our pivot table. So we will take a look at that. We will also take a look at how you can establish default settings inside Excel to automatically format all new pivot tables that you create. Now, these default settings are not going to be available to you for existing pivot tables. They only apply on a prospective basis, but as with styles a moment ago, if you understand how to take advantage of the default settings, once again, you're going to save a tremendous amount of time with respect to formatting your pivot tables. And then our third major learning objective is to make sure that you are aware of and understand the best practice for formatting the numerical data found inside our pivot tables. I think I share a common frustration, likely with many of you participating in this session, and that is quite oftentimes we build a pivot table, we go in and manually apply formats, and then let's say the dimensions of the pivot table change. We all of a sudden have more rows, more columns, additional data, less data, etc. And what we find in so many of those cases is the formats that we apply to the numerical data in the pivot table are not sticky. That is, they don't stay, they don't expand or contract with the pivot table as the pivot table expands and contracts with a new volume of data. You will see in this session that it need not be that way. You will see that there are ways of creating what I call sticky formats, and certainly doing so will reduce a lot of the frustration that we have with pivot table formatting. We've got a lot to talk about in a short period of time, so let's dive right in and get started. Now, as you can see, I've got a relatively simple set of data sitting in a table. There are about 400 rows of data there. And let's suppose that we want to turn this data into a pivot table and then begin to format. Well, the first step of doing so is to create the pivot table. I'm going to click anywhere on that table. And then from the Insert tab of the ribbon, I'm going to say that I want to build my pivot table. Click OK. And now I will simply drag and drop the fields to the appropriate quadrants where I want them for this particular pivot table. Now we're going to keep this one relatively simple. As you can see, I brought each of those dates in as columns, and I brought each of the general ledger accounts in as my rows, and then I, of course, brought the amount field into the body of the pivot table. So, for example, in this pivot table, we're getting summarizations of our expenditures at the intersection of each column and each row label, at the intersection of each month and each general ledger account. That's Pivot Table 101 stuff. Now, kind of continuing with the Pivot Table 101 theme, there are some things here, as I zoom in to make this a little bit easier for all of us to see, there are some things here that I would like to adjust. You see, I come from a school of reporting, if you will, that says if I'm looking at a report, pivot table or otherwise, and I cannot immediately discern the value that something is adding to that report, then it is probably detracting or taking away from that report. And in that vein, I would ask you, somewhat rhetorically, of course, in cell B3, where it currently reads column labels, what value does column labels add to this report? And likewise, what value does row labels in cell A5 add to this report? Again, if you subscribe to the theory that I subscribe to, if we're looking at our reports and we see something and we question its value, then it's probably detracting from the report. What I would like to do in this case is to make those labels, column labels and row labels, I would like to make those disappear. Fortunately, we can do that rather easily. If we look on our Pivot Table Analyze tab of the ribbon and look all the way over here to the far right, we will see the Field Headers button. And if I click on the Field Headers button, notice how those extraneous and I would argue useless text labels that were there a moment ago have now disappeared. If you later determined you wanted to bring those back, click on Field Headers again and they come back. But I frankly don't find that there's any real value in keeping those there. Some would argue, well, wait a minute, how are you going to filter if you get rid of the drop-down arrows? Well, we'll use slicer filters or timeline filters instead, which I think are a far better way of filtering our pivot tables to begin with anyway. Moreover, as we look in cell A3, where we currently see sum of amount, now that is letting us know that the pivot table is summing the amount column. Well, I hope that we already knew that. After all, we're the ones who created the pivot table in the first place. Again, I find that to be extraneous and frankly useless information, not adding a lot of value. So therefore, why don't I just type over that? Why don't I just call that something like summary of expenditures? Something that is a little bit more reflective and frankly a little bit clearer as to what we're actually doing inside the pivot table. Those are a couple of quick kind of high-level issues that I always address in my own pivot tables and would recommend that you spend a little bit of time considering the implications of that. Now, as we are looking here at what else we can do with our pivot tables, a fundamental rule associated with pivot tables is that if you see something on the pivot table that you don't like, such as column labels and row labels, such as sum of amount, the fundamental rule is you can change virtually anything you want on a pivot table with the exception of the numbers in the body of the pivot table. Virtually everything else we can change. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about your pivot tables, even going so far as to saying, look, if I wanted to type over any of these labels, these text labels, beverages, food, insurance, I can do that. If I wanted to rearrange the order of these items, for example, let's take payroll expense and drag and drop and put it underneath beverages, we can rearrange the order. That all goes directly to formatting. We can indeed format our pivot tables to look just about any way we want them to look. We'll come back and actually address those numbers in a moment. For now, let's talk a little bit about pivot table styles. Whenever you build a pivot table, Excel automatically assigns a pivot table style to it. Now, a style is simply a predefined collection of formatting codes. Click on your pivot table, and you will notice that you have a Pivot Table Analyze tab of the ribbon available, and you also have a Pivot Table Design tab of the ribbon. And if you go to the Design tab of the ribbon, you can see the current pivot table style is the one labeled Ice Blue Pivot Style Light 16. Kind of a verbose name, if you will. But that doesn't mean that I have to remain, it doesn't mean I have to continue to use that style. After all, there are a number of pivot table styles that are already prepared and available for me to use. If I wanted to add a little bit of color, kind of put a little polish on it, notice how my grand total row is now bold-faced. I could choose this particular pivot table style, as you can see, the pivot table style light blue medium number 2. In fact, there are quite a few pivot table styles, predefined styles that are indeed available to us. And if you looked and did not find the particular style that you wanted to use for your own department, your company, your division, whatever, know that you can indeed create your own pivot table styles. For example, by clicking this drop-down arrow on the far right-hand side, notice that I can choose New Pivot Table Style. And I will just label this one Test. And when I choose this particular pivot table style, as you can see, I can now go in and apply specific formats for virtually everything on the pivot table. For example, let's do something kind of simple here. Let's say that we wanted to apply a pivot table style create our own custom style that dealt with the first column. Okay, so how do I want that first column to appear? I select that element, I click Format, and then I go and choose how I want this first column to appear. Maybe I want to fill that with a little light gray text, for example. Click OK. And I'll go and say, all right, what about the header row? As far as our header rows, how do we want those to appear? And just to create some stark contrast here, not that I would do it this way in the real world, but maybe I want the header row to be in yellow, for example. Again, I'm doing this for purposes of illustration. You can actually see over here in this little preview pane the effect of what we are doing. Now, again, ultimately, and I'm not really a fan of what I've created so far, let's be clear about that, but let's suppose that that is what we wanted. I could click OK, and now I've got my own custom pivot table style, and when I click on that custom pivot table style, the pivot table is immediately formatted that way. This is a really good thing to remember if you are trying to create consistency in how all of your pivot tables look. You want to make sure that everybody is using the same color schemes, everyone's using the same fonts, etc., etc., etc. You can create these pivot table styles, store them in your book.xltx templates, and they will then be the default. Once you save it as the default style, they will then be the default pivot table style on which all future pivot tables are created. For example, right-clicking on that pivot table style, notice that I can choose to set as default. And again, when I do that, that is going to make that the default pivot table style for every future workbook that I create. So recognize that if you're trying to apply a kind of a global look to all of your pivot tables, you should start that process by working with pivot table styles. We were talking about going in and utilizing default pivot table styles, creating your own default pivot table styles to address, let's call it the cosmetics of formatting. But there are also other elements of formatting that we should address. Let's refer to these more as the structural level of formatting. You might be aware that dating all the way back to the 2007 release of Excel, Microsoft changed the default formatting on pivot tables, and it's a format that not every accounting and financial professional necessarily embraces. More specifically, if we're looking at the pivot table design tab of the ribbon, we jump all the way over on the left-hand side, for example, we can see our subtotals. And by default, what Microsoft started doing back, again, beginning with the 2007 release of Excel, is they started showing the subtotals. If we had subtotals, I'll create some momentarily. They started showing those at the top of a grouping of data inside the pivot tables. Now, most of us as accounting and financial professionals likely prefer our subtotals at the bottom. Notice that you can indeed change that on a pivot table by pivot table basis if you so desire. We'll show you in a moment how you can change that on a global level. To illustrate this point, though, let's go in, for example, and say that we want to group together beverages, payroll, and food. And so I will just group those together. And of course, now you can see that I've got a subtotal for group number 1 at the top of that group. Further, let's go ahead and select insurance all the way down through utilities, right-click and group those together. And again, we got another subtotal for a title now, group number 2, and it also is at the top of those groups. Now again, keeping in mind what I said a few moments ago, that anything on a pivot table, or almost anything on a pivot table that you don't like, you can change. For example, maybe I want to relabel group number 1 and call that cost of goods sold. I can just simply type over that to make that happen. And likewise, maybe I will take the entry on row number 10 and call that operating expenses just by typing over it. So from a formatting perspective, if you don't like what a pivot table says, just type over it. Now you can't do that with the numbers in the body of the pivot table, but you can do that virtually anywhere and everywhere else. And as far as those subtotals being on the top, if I clicked on subtotals and said always show the subtotal, or show the subtotals for this pivot table, I should say, at the bottom of a group, now we can see my subtotals are down at the bottom where most accounting and financial professionals would prefer them. Furthermore, if I were to go back into the pivot table style that I created and applied a boldface element to subtotals, then those subtotals would automatically become bold-faced. or italicized or both or whatever formatting attributes that I wanted to assign to that. So again, recognize that we do indeed have the ability of changing the overall, let's call it the structure of the pivot table to look exactly the way we want it to look. Part and parcel of that also is to consider the report layout. By default, your pivot tables are now set up in what is known as the compact form, and that is designed to save space horizontally. Notice that, however, we could revert back to the previous form, the tabular form, just by choosing, sorry, I clicked the wrong spot. We could choose to format our pivot tables in the tabular form if we so desired. Now, in this example, if I go to the compact form or if I go to the tabular form, you're not seeing any difference, and that is because there are not multiple fields present in column A. If I were to add the vendor field into that column, as I've just done, that's going to get a little bit messy. Let me actually take the subtotal out of there. This will be a little bit easier to see without the subtotals. So now we can see that I'm looking at vendor followed by general ledger account, followed by a total, followed by vendor, general ledger account, a total, etc. That can get a little bit messy. And for that reason, many people prefer to use the tabular form instead of the compact form. With the tabular form, we see our vendor, and then in a separate column, we see the general ledger account to which each of these expenditures are charged. And the fact that those are in two completely separate columns for some makes it a little bit easier to work with. The disadvantage of that particular format, though, is notice how it widens the pivot table out horizontally. If we change that back to the compact form, now obviously we're consuming a lot less space on a horizontal basis. So again, be aware that you can change that. What many would like to do, though, is to create a default set of settings for their pivot tables. And you've been able to do this for several years now in Excel. If we click on the File tab of the ribbon, pardon me, File tab of the ribbon, and then choose Options. Under Options, if we choose Data, the entire top half of this screen is devoted to pivot table options. Not the bottom half, but the entire top half of that screen is indeed devoted to various pivot table options. And without going into each and every one of them just due to the limitations of time, let's focus on the default layout. Notice that in the default layout, I can go and establish a default layout for how I want all of my future pivot tables to look. Now, anything that you do here is not going to impact any existing pivot table. This is only going to affect future pivot tables that you create. And notice, for example, we can go and say, okay, for all future pivot tables, I want my subtotals at the top or at the bottom of the group, or I don't want any subtotals at all. Likewise, do we want grand totals? Do we want grand totals owned for both the rows and the columns, for the columns only, for the rows only, or no grand totals at all? How do we want our default pivot table format, the report layout to look? Do we want to use the compact form? Do we want the tabular form? We get to make these elections, and any election that we make here, excuse me, is going to apply to all future pivot tables that we create. Another really neat thing about this particular dialog box is, let's suppose, not that I'm thrilled with the pivot table that I've created here, but let's suppose that it had in it all of the settings relative to this dialog box anyway, all of the settings that I wanted in all future pivot tables. Well, if that's the case, all I would have to do is click anywhere on this pivot table and then click the import button, and this dialog box would actually import all of those settings that are in the currently selected pivot table. So I don't have to go through each of those drop-down boxes and establish those settings. It's also important to note that from a formatting perspective, if we click on our pivot table options, we have a number of formatting options that are available in the pivot table options dialog box. Now, you can access this dialog box using other means, but importantly, there are a couple of things that we should probably mention here. Notice that there are 5 different tabs across the top. Time will not allow me to go into each and every one of those tabs, but I do want to call your attention to a couple of issues here. Number one, for empty cells, if you generate a pivot table and it returns an empty cell, how do you want that empty cell to appear? Do you want it to appear blank, which is perfectly fine? Would you like to see something like a hyphen in that cell? If so, just type a hyphen in that cell. Would you like to see something like NA in that cell? You can control how your blanks appear. The reason that might be important is many people look at a blank cell and they associate blank with incomplete, and they presume that to be an error. And so if you wanted to fill your blank cells with something that did indeed let your readers know that, hey, we're not really missing anything here, you could do so with that option. A very important setting that you'll want to probably uncheck is the one that says auto-fit the column widths on update. And many of you have struggled with this in the past. You go in and you painstakingly adjust each of the column widths in your pivot table. And then the next time your pivot table refreshes, everything changes. All of those column widths change. That's because you have that box checked. I would think for the overwhelming majority of users, you're going to want that box unchecked. So know that that option is out there. Likewise, you probably also want to preserve all cell formatting on an update. So check that box as well, or check that box. That way, when you refresh your pivot tables, you're not going to lose all of your cell formatting, including column widths, et cetera, et cetera. That has been frustrating likely for many of you. I would encourage you to actually explore each of these tabs and see what they have to offer. I personally think the two most important things that we can do is verify down at the bottom of this dialog box that we've unchecked the box for auto-fit the column widths, and we've checked the box that says preserve cell formatting on update. The last thing that we'll spend just a few moments talking about in terms of the things that have the biggest impact on pivot table formats is the following issue. And that issue is when we have our pivot tables, and I'm going to clean this one up a little bit more. Let's take the vendor out of there just to simplify things. So when I have a pivot table that looks like this, and maybe I'm using some little bit more polished format on it, how do I format the numbers? Better said, how should I format the numbers? Now, I know what most people are doing. The body of the numbers in the pivot table, most people are going in and selecting that entire body of data, and then they're applying what I would call manual formats. They're going and saying, maybe I want that in the comma style, which of course is the accounting format without the currency symbol. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doing it the way that I just did it. However, many of you have experienced a certain level of frustration there, and that is as you go in and manipulate your pivot table, maybe you change the columns and the rows, maybe you add additional fields, what have you, what you found is that your formats that we just applied by applying the formats directly to the cells, those formats were not what I like to call sticky. That is to say, as the pivot table expanded because more data was added to it, the formats did not automatically expand with the pivot table, and you now have to go in and continually reapply the formats to the ever-expanding or ever-rearranging volume of data that is in the pivot table. Let's solve that problem right now. On a going forward basis, never go in and select data in the pivot table like this and then apply the formats using conventional formatting options. The better way of applying your formats, and I'm a right clicker at heart, okay? Doesn't matter which number I click on. Right click on any number and then choose the option that says number format. When we choose the option that says number format and then apply our formats through this format cells dialog box, for example, maybe I want this in the accounting format. Let's put a currency symbol out there just so it's different with 2 decimal places and clicking OK. Now notice how every cell in that field in the pivot table has now received that formatting. And as that pivot table changes, as it grows over time, more rows, more columns, more fields, etc., that format that we apply to that field is going to permanently stay, shall we say, sticky to that field, meaning you will never have to go in and adjust that format again. 3 primary takeaways today. Number 1, you can change anything that you want to on a pivot table. Number 2, we can go in and utilize and create our own pivot table styles. And number three, we can very easily go in and apply formats to the fields as I just did. Let's add a bonus, a fourth one, the default formatting characteristics available inside Excel's options. If you will grasp hold of those four techniques when working with pivot tables, I think you will find that the amount of time that you spend formatting your pivot tables will be greatly curtailed. I thank you for stopping by today. I hope that you found this to be helpful. On behalf of everyone at K2 Enterprises, we look forward to serving you again, hopefully in the very near future. Have a wonderful day.